Hey guys, tonight we begin the story about where did poor peasants stay when on a journey and more. Before you comfortable, like and subscribe the video. And if you really enjoy, then let me in the comment section. So before start the story, turn off your light and maybe on your fan for better environment. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the world before highways, airports, or train stations. A time when the idea of traveling meant walking for hours, perhaps days, along uneven paths, through muddy fields, or across quiet forests. It was the Middle Ages, and for most people, life was not filled with adventures but with routine, farming, tending animals, and working to survive. Yet sometimes even the poorest peasants had to leave their homes and set out on journey. But here is the question, where did they stay when night fell? Where did a man or woman with no wealth, no castle, and no fine horse find shelter on the road? This is what we will explore, slowly, carefully, gently, piece by piece. When we think of history, we often picture kings and queens, knights and battles, or glittering palaces. Yet history is not only made by the powerful, it is also made by those who left little behind, but whose lives built the foundation of society. The peasants, poor farmers and villagers, were the backbone of medieval Europe, and even they had reasons to travel, to visit a distant market, to attend a festival, to walk on a holy pilgrimage, or to seek work in another town. Travel was never easy. There were no hotels waiting with clean sheets. There were no maps in every pocket. Instead, travelers relied on simple shelters, kind strangers, or even the earth beneath their feet. To us, this may sound uncomfortable, but for them, it was ordinary. This story will move slowly, not rushing, so that you can picture each detail and allow your mind to drift as if you too are walking along those medieval roads. Imagine the sound of your footsteps on gravel, the call of birds overhead, and the soft rustle of the wind through the fields. Tonight, we will wander through the world of peasants and ask, where did they sleep when they traveled? What dangers did they face? What little comforts did they find? And along the way, we will explore much more. The inns and monasteries, the barns and cottages, the markets and fairs, the dangers of the road, and the difference between rich and poor travelers. So, let us begin our quiet journey into the past, where history moves slowly and where the ordinary details of life tell us more than great battles ever could. Close your eyes, relax, and step back in time. The journey is beginning. If you wish to understand where peasants stayed while traveling, you must first understand what their ordinary life was like. For most peasants in the Middle Ages, life was not full of choices. It was tied to the rhythm of the land. The rising sun marked the beginning of work, and the setting sun marked the end. Most peasants were serfs bound to the land of a lord. They did not own their farms outright. Instead, they were given the right to work small strips of land in exchange for service, rent, or labor. Their lives were humble, but their work was the very heart of society. Without their labor, there would be no bread on the table of a king, no ale in the mug of a knight, and no wool for the clothing of merchants. Daily life in the village of peasants' day began early. The rooster crowed, and before the first light, a man or woman would be stirring from a straw mattress inside a timber and thatch cottage. These cottages were small, often just one or two rooms, with a hearth in the center and smoke seeping through a hole in the roof. Families slept close together for warmth, sometimes with animals sharing the same space during the coldest months. Food was simple. Dark bread made from rye or barley, a thin pottage made of beans and vegetables, perhaps a little cheese, and if luck was kind, a bit of bacon or salted fish. Meat was rare, and milk was often turned into butter or cheese for storage. Life was hard, but it was steady. The peasants' tasks were endless. Plowing, sowing seeds, weeding, harvesting, tending sheep or pigs, fetching water, mending tools, repairing fences. For women, there was the added work of spinning, weaving, baking, cooking, and caring for children. There was no timepiece but the seasons themselves. And yet, despite this hard life, peasants sometimes traveled. Why would a poor peasant travel? Travel was rare for peasants. Most people lived and died within 20 miles of the place they were born. But sometimes necessity or faith called them onto the road. Pilgrimages. Religion was at the heart of medieval life. A peasant might set out on a journey to visit a holy shrine, perhaps Canterbury in England, Santiago de Compostela in Spain, or a local saint's tomb. These journeys could take days, weeks, or even months. and along the way the pilgrim would need places to rest. Markets and fairs. Not every village had a large market. Sometimes peasants traveled to nearby towns to sell wool, grain, or animals. Great fairs like the famous Champagne fairs in France drew people from far and wide. Work and service. A poor laborer might set out to seek work in another village, or a serf might be required to accompany his lord's household. During wars, peasants were sometimes forced to march with armies, carrying supplies or building fortifications. Family and marriage. Travel could also mean visiting relatives in other villages or attending weddings, funerals, or seasonal festivals. Thus, though rare, travel was a part of peasant life. And when they traveled, they could not afford fine inns or noble lodgings. They needed simple shelter. Clothing and appearance of peasants on the road. Picture a peasant setting out on a journey. He wears a simple tunic of rough wool, perhaps dyed brown or green with natural colors. On his feet are leather shoes, worn and patched. He carries a cloak for warmth and a hood to protect against rain. A woman might carry a basket, a spindle for spinning as she walks, or a child in her arms. Luggage was light. A sack of bread and cheese, perhaps a knife, maybe a wooden cup or a small flask of ale. Everything had to be carried on the back or in hand. Horses were a luxury reserved for the wealthy. A walking stick was a common companion, useful for balance, protection, and as a symbol of the road. The mental world of a peasant traveler. It is important to remember that medieval people did not think of travel as we do. For them, the road was filled with uncertainty. Forests were deep, and superstition was strong. Travelers feared not only robbers but also spirits, witches, and strange omens. Every crossroads had meaning. Every ruined chapel or lonely stone might be thought to hold danger, and yet there was also a sense of wonder. To leave one's village, to see new faces, to hear new songs, to taste bread baked in another town, this was rare and exciting. A pilgrim might bring home stories of distant places. A peasant girl, married into another village, might describe new customs. In this way, peasants, though poor and bound to the land, carried small pieces of the world with them whenever they traveled. The question of shelter, but where, then, did they stay? This question will be answered in greater detail later. For now, imagine a poor traveler at the end of a long day's walk. His feet are sore, his belly aches with hunger. The sun is dipping behind the horizon, and the fields are falling into shadow. If he is lucky, he may find a monastery where monks offer food and a place to sleep. If less fortunate, he might find a village alehouse where a few coins could buy a place on the floor. Sometimes a barn was the best option, warm with straw to lie upon. Other times, the traveler might simply sleep by the roadside, under the open sky. It was not glamorous, but it was survival. And for a peasant, survival was enough. Life, work, and the rhythm of seasons. To better imagine the peasant's world, think of the 4 seasons. In spring, peasants sowed seeds, repaired their tools, and prepared the land. In summer, they worked from dawn to dusk in the fields, gathering hay and tending crops. In autumn, the harvest was the most important time of year. Every hand, young or old, worked to gather grain. In winter, life slowed. Work shifted indoors, spinning, weaving, mending, storytelling by the hearth. Winter was also the most dangerous time for travelers. Roads were muddy or frozen, food was scarce, and cold nights were deadly. Many avoided travel altogether until spring. Thus, the world of the peasant was one of cycles. And within these cycles, the rare act of travel was an interruption, an uncertain adventure. When we think of travel today, we imagine smooth highways, trains, or airplanes. But for the poor peasant of the Middle Ages, the road was nothing like this. It was a winding, unpredictable path, sometimes nothing more than a dirt track across a field, or a narrow trail through the woods. And yet these roads, humble as they were, connected the villages of medieval Europe. They carried pilgrims to holy shrines, traders to distant markets, and even peasants searching for work. To understand where peasants stayed, we must first understand the roads they walked upon. The Roman ghosts beneath their feet centuries before the medieval age, the Romans had built magnificent roads, straight, paved, and durable. Roman roads stretched across much of Europe. Some of these survived into the Middle Ages, and where they did, travel was easier. Pilgrims walking to Canterbury or Rome sometimes found themselves treading on stones laid down by Roman soldiers 1,000 years earlier. But not all lands had such luck. In many regions, the Roman roads crumbled, and what remained were little more than broken paths. Rain washed away soil, stones turned uneven, and weeds crept in. By the early medieval period, travelers often faced rough, muddy tracks that were difficult to pass, especially in winter. The nature of medieval roads a peasant traveler might walk along. Dirt tracks, these were the most common. In dry weather, they were dusty. In rain, they became slippery rivers of mud. Forest paths narrow, shaded, and sometimes dangerous. Bandits or wolves could appear without warning. Cart roads, wider paths where ox carts and wagons traveled, but filled with ruts and puddles that could swallow a wheel. Causeways, raised roads across marshes or wetlands. These were rare and often in poor repair. Bridges, simple wooden structures, often built by monasteries or towns. If no bridge existed, peasants waded across rivers or relied on ferrymen who charged small fees. For a nobleman on horseback, these roads were difficult. For a poor peasant on foot, they were exhausting. The pace of the journey travel was slow. A peasant could walk about 10 to 15 miles in a day if the weather was fair. Heavy rain, swollen rivers, or illness could reduce that distance. Women with children or the elderly walked even less. There were no road signs as we know them today. Instead, people followed landmarks. A hill in the distance, a church tower, or a large oak tree at a crossroads. Sometimes carved crosses or small shrines were set up to guide travelers or to protect them spiritually as they passed. Dangers on the road traveling as a peasant was never entirely safe. As robbers and bandits, poor men who turned to crime often waited in forests or at crossroads. They stole food, money, or clothing. The lone traveler was especially vulnerable. Wild animals, wolves roamed parts of Europe. Boars were dangerous if startled. Even stray dogs could be a threat. Natural hazards, rivers with no bridge, deep mud, sudden storms or landslides could delay or endanger travelers. Suspicion of strangers' villages were tight-knit communities. A wandering peasant could be viewed with distrust, questioned, or even turned away by fearful locals. Despite these dangers, the roads were lifelines. Without them, peasants could not reach markets, shrines, or other villages. Fellow travelers, the road was rarely empty. A peasant traveler might encounter pilgrims marked by staffs, badges, and humble cloaks heading toward holy sites, merchants leading pack animals or pushing carts carrying cloth, salt, or wine, monks and friars moving between monasteries, often willing to share food or prayers, soldiers sometimes marching to war, sometimes returning from it, figures both awe-inspiring and frightening. Other peasants perhaps traveling for work or to visit family, each carrying their own story. For a poor peasant on the road, there was comfort in company. People often walked together for safety, sharing bread, ale, and stories to pass the time. The spiritual landscape, the roads of medieval Europe, were not only physical but spiritual. Crosses and shrines dotted the paths, offering comfort to weary travelers. Many believed the road itself was watched over by saints or angels. Some travelers carried charms against evil, or they prayed before setting out, asking for safe passage. The church taught that all life was a journey, with heaven as the final destination. Walking along an actual road felt symbolic, as though each step mirrored the soul's path through the world. For peasants who lived so closely with faith, this idea gave meaning to their weary travels. Nightfall on the road. Imagine a peasant walking at dusk. The sun sinks behind the hills. Shadows stretch across the fields. The forest ahead looks darker, less inviting. The air grows colder. This is the moment when the traveler begins to worry. Where will I sleep tonight? If near a village, he might ask for shelter in a barn. If near a monastery, he might hope the monks will grant him bread and a corner by the fire. If he is unlucky, he may sleep by the roadside, wrapped in his cloak, listening to the sounds of owls and distant wolves. The road was not merely a path. It was a test of patience, courage, and endurance. For the poor peasant, every mile was won by the strength of his own feet. Roads as carriers of culture, despite their hardships, roads were also bridges between worlds. Songs, stories, and rumors traveled with peasants as much as goods. A peasant from one village might bring back a new tale, a different way of baking bread, or even a fragment of news about a distant war or a faraway king. Thus, while most peasants never saw more than a handful of miles beyond their home, the roads ensured that ideas, faith, and customs flowed through medieval Europe like slow rivers. And so the roads were rough, uneven, and uncertain, but they were also the arteries of life, carrying even the poorest peasant from one place to another, step by careful step. We have walked with the poor peasant along the roads of medieval Europe. We have felt the mud beneath his feet, the cold of the forest at dusk, and the uncertainty of each step. But the most important question still lingers. Where did this traveler, poor and weary, actually rest his head when night fell? 1. In the barns of villagers, perhaps the most common place for a poor peasant to sleep was not an inn, not a tavern, not a monastery, but a barn. Barns were warm compared to the open air. They were filled with hay, straw, or even animals that gave off body heat. A traveler might politely knock on the door of a cottage and ask, "May I rest in your barn tonight?" The answer depended on the generosity of the villagers. Sometimes they welcomed a stranger. Other times suspicion was strong. A poor traveler might be mistaken for a thief or beggar. Still, many peasants were willing to share what little they had, for they too knew the hardships of travel. Sleeping in a barn was not comfortable. The straw was itchy. Rats might scurry about, but compared to the cold earth outside, it was a blessing. 2. Alehouses and taverns. Though peasants had little money, alehouses dotted the landscape. These were simple, rough buildings, often no more than a single smoky room with a fire. A traveler could pay a few coins for ale and perhaps ask to sleep by the hearth. Wealthier folk hired beds in inns, but a poor man was lucky if the alehouse owner allowed him to curl up in a corner. Sometimes the traveler shared the floor with strangers, a merchant's apprentice, a wandering minstrel, or another peasant like himself. The floor was hard, but the warmth of the fire, the smell of roasting meat, and the sound of voices made the traveler feel less alone. 3. Monasteries and religious houses. The medieval church played an important role in hospitality. Many monasteries were bound by tradition to provide food and shelter to pilgrims and travelers, even if they were poor. Arriving at a monastery, a peasant might knock on the gate and beg for a night's rest. The monks, if willing, would guide him to the guest hall. This was a simple space, bare walls, wooden benches, perhaps a pallet of straw. Bread, broth, or ale might be given. The traveler would not stay long, usually only one night, sometimes two. But for that brief time he had safety. The monastery walls kept out thieves and wolves. The bells in the tower reminded him of God's watchful presence. 4. Church porches and cemeteries for those with nowhere else to go. The church itself offered a kind of sanctuary. A peasant might sleep beneath the porch of a parish church wrapped in his cloak. Some even lay among the gravestones, believing the holy ground would protect them from evil spirits. The stone floor was cold, the air damp, but there was comfort in being close to the church. Many believed that sleeping near sacred ground meant the saints themselves kept watch. 5. Roadside shelters and hospices along popular pilgrimage routes, such as the road to Santiago de Compostela. Charitable foundations built hospices for poor travelers. These were not luxurious places. Imagine a long wooden hall with straw on the floor, crowded with men and women, coughing, snoring, and praying. But they were free, funded by nobles, bishops, or guilds. These shelters reminded people that hospitality was a Christian duty. A weary peasant could rest, eat a little bread, and continue his journey at dawn. 6. The homes of strangers. Hospitality was not only institutional. Sometimes peasants knocked on the doors of ordinary homes. A simple family might offer a bench by the fire or a place on the floor. This was risky. Some doors slammed shut, others welcomed with kindness. A loaf of bread, a shared bowl of stew, and a spot in front of the hearth could turn a miserable night into one of warmth and gratitude. 7. Beneath the open sky, and yet many peasants found themselves without shelter. They slept in fields, under hedges, or in the shelter of a tree. Imagine this. The stars glitter above. The grass is damp with dew. The peasant wraps himself tightly in his cloak, perhaps placing his pack under his head as a pillow. Every rustle in the dark makes him uneasy. The distant howl of a wolf or the bark of a dog keeps his eyes open longer than he wishes. Such nights were cold and lonely, but they were free. The land itself became the peasant's bed. What did they sleep on? Beds in the modern sense were rare luxuries. A poor traveler slept on whatever he could find. Straw, piled loosely in barns or hospices. Cloaks rolled beneath the body for warmth. Wooden benches, hard but dry. Bare earth with only a pack for a pillow. Clean sheets were unknown to peasants. Lice and fleas were common companions. Sleep was often shallow and restless. Sharing spaces, peasants rarely slept alone while traveling. In barns, taverns, or hospices, travelers shared space closely with others. There was little privacy. Snoring filled the air, coughs echoed, children whimpered. In winter, people huddled together for warmth. Strangers pressed shoulder to shoulder to shoulder. Though uncomfortable, this closeness offered safety. Alone, a peasant risked attack. In numbers, there was protection. The rhythm of night when the sun set, life slowed. Medieval nights were truly dark. No streetlights, no electricity, only moonlight and stars. Travelers went to sleep early, often soon after dusk. The night was long, filled with shallow sleep broken by sounds of animals or passing strangers. At dawn, the peasant rose again, stretching aching limbs, ready to walk once more. Hospitality is a value in medieval thought. Offering shelter was more than kindness. It was a Christian duty. The Bible told believers to welcome strangers, for in doing so they might welcome angels. Thus, though many peasants slept cold and hungry, there was always hope. Behind some door in some barn, by some hearth, a bit of shelter might be found. The journey continues. Where did peasants sleep? In barns, on tavern floors, in monasteries, under church porches, in hospices, in strangers' homes, or simply beneath the stars. Each night was uncertain. Each morning was a gift. For the peasant, the journey was not measured only in miles walked, but in the kindness or harshness of the world around him. Traveling in the Middle Ages was not just a matter of walking, finding a place to sleep. The deeper challenge was food. For a poor peasant, every step of the road raised the question, what shall I eat today? Food was not always available. Villages might be miles apart. Markets opened only on certain days, and coins were scarce in the pocket of a laborer. Still, medieval travelers developed strategies for survival. Bread, the traveler's companion, the foundation of every peasant's diet was bread. A traveler might carry a few loaves tucked in his satchel, baked hard so they would last for days. This bread was often coarse, made of rye, barley, or oats rather than fine wheat. It was heavy, dense, and sometimes sour. To soften stale bread, the traveler might dip it in ale, broth, or even plain water. It filled the stomach even if it gave little joy. Bread was so central that to a break bread, not just to eat, but to share life. On the road, a crust of bread offered by a stranger could feel like a miracle. 2. Cheese and butter. Peasants sometimes carried cheese, a food that could survive a journey without spoiling too quickly. Imagine a round of hard cheese wrapped in cloth pulled from a traveler's pack. A few bites of bread, a slice of cheese, and suddenly the hunger eased. Butter was rarer on journeys, for it spoiled quickly, but in colder months, travelers carried small amounts. Spread on bread, it added fat and flavor that made the simple meal sustaining. 3. Dried or salted meat. Fresh meat was a luxury few peasants enjoyed while traveling. But salted pork or dried fish could sometimes be carried. These foods were tough and salty, but they lasted. Salt preserved them from rot, making them useful for long journeys. A strip of dried beef chewed slowly, washed down with ale, might serve as dinner. Still, meat was rare. More often, peasants traveled with none, relying on bread, dairy, and whatever they could beg. 4. Ale and small beer. Water was not always safe to drink. Rivers carried disease. Wells were uncertain. Instead, peasants drank ale or small beer, weakly brewed beverages with little alcohol. Brewing boiled the water, killing germs, and the grain provided nourishment. A traveler might carry a flask of ale or stop at an alehouse for a mug. The drink filled the belly, quenched thirst, and gave energy for the road. 5. Pottage. The peasants stew when lucky enough to stay in a village or hospice. A traveler might be offered pottage. Pottage was the most common hot meal of peasants. A thick stew of grains, vegetables, and whatever bits of meat or herbs were available. No two bowls of pottage were alike. One day it might be thick with cabbage and beans, another day thin with only onions and barley. To the hungry traveler, even the thinnest broth was welcome. 6. Foraging on the road. Peasants knew the land. On the road they gathered food where they could. Berries in the hedgerows, nuts from trees in autumn, wild herbs like nettles or sorrel to chew for strength, mushrooms, though dangerous if chosen wrongly. These offerings of nature were free, though not always abundant. A handful of berries might sweeten a long, hard day. 7. Charity meals. Christian duty meant that the poor could sometimes rely on the generosity of others. Churches often kept alms tables, where bread was distributed to the needy. Wealthy households might offer scraps to beggars at the gate. Monasteries gave simple meals of bread, broth, and ale. A traveler who appeared humble and respectful might receive food for free. A traveler who appeared suspicious might be turned away hungry. 8. Pilgrim provisions. Special rules applied for pilgrims, those walking to holy sites such as Canterbury, Rome, or Santiago. Along the way, hospices and pilgrim houses offered free or cheap meals. These usually consisted of bread, cheese, and thin broth. Some great monasteries provided generous feasts to pilgrims, for feeding them was seen as holy work. Even so, pilgrim food was not plentiful. Many still relied on what they carried. A pilgrim's staff might support his body, but his crust of bread supported his soul. 9. Markets and roadside vendors. On certain days, travelers reached villages holding market fairs. These were lively places filled with shouting merchants and the smell of roasting food. Here, traveler with a coin or two might buy a hot meat pie, a cup of spiced wine, fresh fruit in season, a small cake or honey bread. For a poor peasant, such purchases were rare luxuries. But even watching others eat at market stalls gave a sense of life and community after lonely miles on the road. 10. Hunger as a constant companion. Despite these options, the truth was stark. Many peasants went hungry while traveling. A crust of bread might be all they ate in a day. Sometimes nothing at all passed their lips until evening. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs as steadily as the road wore at their feet, and yet they pressed on. The hope of reaching family, market, or pilgrimage site kept them walking. The traveler's meal a simple picture. Picture it now. A weary peasant sits beneath a tree at dusk. From his pack he pulls a chunk of hard rye bread, a slice of dried cheese, a flask of weak ale. He eats slowly, each bite heavy but sustaining. Around him, the sounds of evening fill the air. Crickets, the call of a night bird, the rustle of wind in the leaves. This was not a feast, it was survival. Yet for the medieval peasant, it was enough to live another day, to walk another mile. The meaning of food on the road. Food was more than nourishment. On the road, it was comfort, hope, and life itself. A crust shared with a stranger meant friendship. A bowl of pottage from a monastery meant God's mercy. A handful of berries gathered from the hedgerows meant that the world itself still offered gifts. Each bite told a story. Each swallow carried the traveler forward. Thanks for watching this emotional medieval story. Subscribe for more interesting stories.